Water is the one thing every living creature on Earth needs to survive. Not money, not electricity, not the internet. Water. Yet every day rivers shrink, wells dry up, and lakes that once held life turn into cracked earth. Across the world, people are slowly discovering something frightening. The water they depend on is disappearing. How does a river die? Who is responsible? And more importantly, can it be brought back to life? This is the story of two children who asked those questions when no one else would. It is also the story of a river that had been sending warnings for years, warnings that everyone ignored, until someone finally listened. 11-year-old Kofi was the first person in the village to truly notice, because he was the first person willing to look closely. For generations, the river called Nsu had flowed beside the village. Children swam in it, farmers watered crops from it, fishermen filled their nets from it. But things had begun to change. First, one dry season passed, and the river dropped lower than usual. The adults said it was normal. The next year, the river dropped even more. The adults said the rains would return. Then the fishing nets started coming up empty. Still, no one worried. Until one Tuesday morning, Kofi stood on the riverbank with a metal bucket in his hand and felt his stomach tighten. Half the river was gone. Not slightly smaller, not a little lower, half of it. What had once been a wide ribbon of moving water was now a thin, muddy stream clinging to one side of a cracked riverbed. Dead fish floated near the edge, the reeds had turned brown, even the frogs had stopped singing. Kofi. His younger sister Ama stood beside him, staring at the empty riverbed. Where did it go? Kofi didn't know, but unlike most people in the village, he refused to pretend nothing was wrong. "I'm going to find out," he said. Kofi started asking questions. His father barely looked up from repairing a fishing net. "Dry season," he said. "The river will return." His teacher, Mr. Obuobi, glanced out the classroom window. "Nature has cycles," he explained. When Kofi told the village chief's assistant, the man simply waved his hand. "We will dig the well deeper." But it was Madame Ofori, the science teacher, who surprised him. She didn't wave him away. She didn't look out a window. She looked directly at Kofi and was quiet for a moment. "You've actually been to the river," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She studied his face. "Come back after school," she said. "Bring your sister." Kofi didn't know what to make of that. She hadn't agreed with him, but she hadn't dismissed him either. That felt like something. Before they went anywhere, they needed to understand one thing: how rivers actually work. Their school library was small, but one old book caught Kofi's attention. It was called Earth Science for Young Learners. Inside, they discovered something important. A river does not create its own water. It collects it. Rain falls on hills and forests. Some water flows across the surface, but much of it sinks into the ground. Slowly, underground water feeds streams. Streams join together and form rivers. Eventually, those rivers reach the sea. But there was something else the book explained, something most people forget. Trees are part of the water system. Trees slow down rainfall with their leaves. Their roots hold soil in place. Their shade keeps water from evaporating too quickly. And through a process called transpiration, trees release water vapor into the air. That vapor forms clouds. Those clouds become rain. In other words, trees help create the rain that feeds rivers. Ama stopped writing. "If someone cuts the trees," she said slowly, "the rain decreases." Kofi nodded. "And if the rain decreases, the river gets less water." They looked at each other. "Ama," Kofi said quietly. "Yes?" "I think someone has been cutting trees." They left before sunrise on Saturday. The river began just outside the village and curved north through fields and patches of bush. At first, everything looked normal. Birds called from tree branches, grass rustled in the wind. But after an hour, something changed. The green began to disappear. Trees became stumps. Then the forest vanished entirely. A hillside ahead of them had been stripped bare. Hundreds of trees had been cut down. Fresh stumps dotted the red soil like scars. Without roots to hold the ground together, rainwater had carved deep channels down the hillside. The soil was washing away. Ama slowly turned in a circle. "There used to be a forest here," she whispered. Kofi knelt and examined the ground. Where trees once stood, only cracked earth remained. He wrote in the notebook, "When trees disappear, rainwater runs off too quickly. The soil washes away. Less water reaches the river." Ama pointed to the slope. "The ground is broken." Further upstream, they found the people responsible. 5 men were working near the remaining trees. 2 cut logs with chainsaws. 2 loaded wood onto a truck. Another tended a smoking mound of earth, a charcoal kiln. Kofi stepped forward. "We followed the river," he said. The men looked surprised. One of them approached. His name was Mr. Asare. He didn't look like a villain. He looked exhausted. "I know why you're here," he said quietly. He explained that charcoal was how he fed his family. The nearby city had grown, and people needed cooking fuel. "If I stop cutting trees," he said, "my children do not eat." Kofi hesitated before answering. "If the river dies," he said carefully, "everyone's children go hungry." Mr. Asare looked at the empty hillside. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he sighed. "I know." Ama wrote in the notebook, "Deforestation is not always caused by bad people. Sometimes it happens because people have no other choice." On the walk home, Ama suddenly stopped. "Kofi," she said, "the river is a circle." She drew in the dust with a stick. Water becomes clouds. Clouds become rain. Rain feeds trees. Trees feed rivers. Rivers flow to the ocean. Then the cycle begins again. "But when the trees disappear," she said, "the circle breaks. No trees, less rain, less river." Kofi stared at the drawing. Ama brushed the dust away. "And the adults still think the river will fix itself." They began speaking to people in the village. Auntie Comfort, a farmer, showed them dying tomato plants. "The river water is full of mud now," she said. Old Kweku, the fisherman, explained that fish need cool, clean water, something only trees along the riverbanks can protect. "A river without trees," he said, "is like a body without skin." By sunset, Kofi and Ama had spoken to 7 families. Farmers, fishermen, mothers, children. Every life in the village depended on the river. That night, Kofi and Ama created a plan. Problem 1, the trees were gone. Solution, plant new ones. Reforestation could restore the hillside and help the river recover. Problem 2, the charcoal workers needed income. Solution, find programs that reward communities for protecting forests. Some governments and international groups pay villages to preserve forests because living trees absorb carbon dioxide and slow climate change. Alive, the forest was more valuable than cut down. If the village understood that, everything could change. At school assembly, Kofi asked to speak. He explained the water cycle. Ama showed her drawings. They described the hillside, the stumps, the cracked soil. The courtyard was silent. Then one student asked, "Can we plant trees ourselves?" Ama smiled. "Yes." Madame Ofori stood up and called for a community meeting. More than 60 villagers attended. Some doubted the children. A farmer named Mr. Boateng crossed his arms and shook his head. "Children are telling us how to manage our land now," he said. "My grandfather farmed here, and his grandfather before him. The river has always recovered." Several people murmured in agreement. Kofi felt his hands go cold. He looked at Ama. She stepped forward, calm as still water. "Mr. Boateng," she said, "when your grandfather farmed here, was the hillside covered in trees?" The old man opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought for a long moment. "Yes," he said slowly. Yes, it was. The room went quiet. Then Mr. Asare stood up. "The children are right," he said. "I have seen the hillside. I have helped make it what it is." He looked at the floor. "That is not easy for me to say." The silence that followed was heavy and honest. Then Madame Afore spoke. "We are not here to blame anyone," she said. "We are here because the river is still alive, and we still have time." Soon after, some forestry officers visited the village and confirmed everything. Madame Afore helped the villagers apply for a reforestation program. Then, the most important thing happened. They started planting trees. Over 3 Saturdays, more than 100 villagers climbed the hillside and planted hundreds of seedlings. Ama named each row, for the fish, for the farmers, for the children who will come after us. The forest would take years to grow, but healing had begun. 2 years later, Kofi returned to the hillside alone. He almost didn't recognize it. Where cracked red earth had stretched in every direction, young trees now rose in uneven, hopeful rows. Their roots, still small, still growing, held the soil in place. Thin streams of clean water ran between them after a recent rain, finding their way downhill, finding the river. He stood there for a long time. He thought about Mr. Asare, who had since joined a sustainable charcoal cooperative, one that replanted 2 trees for everyone they used. He thought about Mr. Botang, who had become the loudest voice at every planting day, telling anyone who would listen about the forest his grandfather had known. He thought about old Kweku, who had caught fish again last month for the first time in 3 years, and had wept quietly on the bank before anyone could see. Ama came up behind him and crouched beside a young tree no taller than her knee. She pressed her fingers gently into the damp soil around its base. "It's working," she said. "Slowly," Kofi replied. "That's how rivers work," she said, "and trees." She stood and looked down at the water below, thin but moving, clear in a way it hadn't been in years. "And most things worth saving," she said. Kofi didn't answer. He didn't need to. Below them, the river flowed, still healing, still trying, still carrying its story forward. It had never stopped speaking. It had only been waiting for someone young enough to still believe that listening mattered.